Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Nun Bet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with this big machloket, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, which we're going to learn head on today. What are the sources for each of them, and how does each one respond to the other sources? Where we're talking about an idol worshiper and a Jew, and each one we're going to have this big debate about when an idol worshiper makes an idol. Is it forbidden immediately or only once it's worshipped? The fact that a Jew can't benefit from that idol, okay? Is it immediately as soon as it was fashioned or only once it was worshipped? And same thing with the Jew. So we started with understanding Rabbi Yishmael's position. That was the bright we started yesterday. Said Abed ta'abdun et kol makomot asher avdu sham hagoyim. Notice it says asher avdu sham hagoyim. Get rid of all the mikomot, which we said actually are vessels that are used to serve the idol. Notice we haven't yet talked about the idol itself. We'll get there. The vessels that serve the idols, the idols, are forbidden. Asher avdu sham hagoyim, that the Gentiles worshipped. So that means only after they worship them is it going to be forbidden. Then we basically prove that Mekomot is not really locations, it's really Kelim, because Kelim, right, we already learned that only Kelim were forbidden, but not locations like mountains, etc. And that's from later on in that same pasuk. Abei tabduna kol mekomot, destroy all those places. Asher abdu sham hogoyim asher atem yorshim otam. Okay, this is in Dvarim chapter 12, that worship the nations that you're inheriting their land. Et Elohem al harim aramim al agvaot b'tachal kol eitz ra'anat, right? They're gods that you're worshiping, that they're worshiping on the mountains, on the hills. Okay, we spent a lot of time on that. By the way, I want to mention yesterday, I have to correct one small thing. We talked about these psukim, totally different context. Al petach omei lo v'yo d'shchutei chutz. And by accident, there were two different sets of psukim. One was in Dvarim, but the real set of psukim that we were focusing on, the ones that until this section is that kind, and after that section is that kind, and the one about the Seirim, that was actually from Vayikra Yud Zayin, not Dvarim Yud Zayin. My mistake. And if you want to look up those psukim, look in Vayikra, chapter 17, and not in Dvarim. Okay, now the Gemara then said, okay, so now we're trying to understand how do we get to Kelim, because it can't be that, it must be Kelim. Mikan Amru, and then from here we make one more jump, which is Avodah Zarah shalovei kochavim ein asura ad shete'aved shel Yisrael miyad. So now they're saying from here, from that pasuk, this is where they learned that the Gentiles who created the idol worship Gentiles who created idols are only forbidden. They're only forbidden to Jews once they're worshipped. But wait, what did I mention just before? The drashan, the pasuk about that they fashioned for the right asher abdu, that they worshipped, and only when they worshipped is it a problem, was talking about the kelim, that it served the idols, but not the idol itself. Amakra, no, but look at the pasuk. It says asher atem yorshim otam et Elohehem. Notice it says it's right, the kelim or the mekomot, which are the kelim, the vessels, which you're inheriting, and they're gods. So now they say, makish Elohem lekelim, ma kelim ad she'avdu, af Elohem nami ad she'avdu. So because the et Elohem is mentioned later in the pasuk, we say the gods are like the kelim. And just like the kelim are only forbidden once they worship them, also the gods are only forbidden once they worship them. Because we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva agrees about the kelim. The side things, of course, they're only forbidden once they're used as worship items. Okay, once you use them. But the idol itself, Rabbi Akiva thinks it's actually forbidden immediately, and Rabbi Ishmael here, which is the opinion we're reading, says only later. Now, Rabbi Akiva, what's he going to say? Well, the pasuk connects those two. So why wouldn't we say we learn from the kelim to the gods, to the idols? For Rabbi Akiva, the Makish, Amar Lacha et Tipsika. Notice it says et Elohehem. That word et is a separator. There's the vessels, which are Asher Avdu, and then there's the idols, which are, we're going to be more strict about them and prohibit them immediately. Okay. Rabbi Ishmael. So now that was, okay, we're going to have A and B. A is Rabbi Ishmael, B is Rabbi Akiva. And then within A, we're going to have 1 and 2. And within B, we're going to have 1 and 2. So in A, we have 1. We explained why the idol worship, if an idol worshiper makes the idol, it's only going to be forbidden once it's worshipped. That's the pasuk we read. Now we're going to say, okay, so now we have to get to section 2 of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael, so we understood an idol worshiper's idol is only going to be forbidden once they worship it. The Yisrael sulamiyat, minale. But how does he get that when a Jew makes it, it's going to be forbidden immediately? Svarahu, he says, is logical. Why is it logical? Well, notice the pasuk said only the goyim, right? Asher avdu shama goyim. So midove kochavim ad shteaved Israel asura miyad. In other words, just process of elimination. If the oved kochavim is only forbidden until it's worshipped, then the Jews must be forbidden immediately. So now they say that's not a good logic because you could just say Emed Yisrael klalu klalo. Maybe you just say specifically you have to get rid of all the idols that were made by Gentiles in the land. It's part of like uprooting everything in the land. But if a Jew creates an idol, okay, it's not forbidden. You don't have to destroy it. Maybe you don't have to destroy it at all. Maybe it's not forbidden at all. To which the Gemara says, can't say it's not forbidden at all. Hashta Genizabaya, we know, well, we don't know yet, but we're going to see later in today's daf, that it has to be buried. Okay, you can't use it at all. You can bury it. That's what you do with things you can't use. Itsure lo mitascha. So what, you're going to say it's not forbidden? Of course it's forbidden. So you can't go the other way and say it's completely permitted, which means we're going to say it's completely forbidden, meaning even once it was fashioned. But they say no. Ema kidove kochavim. Maybe you could just say it's just the same. The pasuk doesn't say only Gentiles, nobody else. It does say shavdu shama goyim, but could be also if a Jew does it like a idol worshiper, maybe it'll be the same. So that's not a good enough proof. So second attempt. We're gonna have 3 attempts here. Amakra ve'et chatatchem asher asitem et ha'egel. This is a pasuk about the sinning of the golden calf, and Moshe says to them, the sin that you did with the egel, notice it says asitem et egel, that you made the egel, you formed it, you fashioned it. That's going to be key here. And then it says, Moshe says, I burned and I chopped it up, crushed it into pieces, teeny little pieces. And now notice it's talking about destroying it completely. And right, it's talking about that you fashioned the egel. Mishat asiyah kam lebechet. So from the moment you made the egel, you sinned, and therefore from the moment of making the egel, it's forbidden. To which the Gemara says that's not true necessarily. Could be the people had already sinned by just fashioning the egel, but it doesn't mean, right, the golden calf, but it doesn't mean that the golden calf itself is forbidden at that point. Maybe it's only forbidden from the point that they worship it. Okay, attempt number 3. And final attempt, although it will take us a little time to get there, because we're going to have a little back and forth. Okay, and the curses in Sefer Dvarim, it says, cursed is the man who makes a pesel and a masecha. Notice it says who fashions it. He's cursed from the moment he makes it. To which the Gemara is going to say just like the previous. That means the man is cursed. It doesn't necessarily mean it's forbidden. Toavat Hashem ktiv. Well, it says it's Toav. That pasuk says, okay, we'll read the whole pasuk and we're going to read even a little bit more because we're going to get back to this pasuk. Arura isha sheyaseh pesel masecha. Okay, it's in Dvarim chapter 27. Toavat Hashem aseh yedei charash. Okay, it's despicable what this craftsman made. Visham, visam beseter, and it has to be put in secret. Okay, we're going to have different drashot on that verse in a little while. Rabbi Akiva, so now, here we have it. Toavat Hashem means the object itself is already despised. From when? From the moment it was made, because that's what the pasuk says. And that would be Rabbi Akiva's proof. Rabbi Yishmael's proof. That's why Rabbi Yishmael says the Jew is going to be forbidden from the moment it's fashioned, from this pasuk about the curses. To Rabbi Akiva, what's Rabbi Akiva going to say? Well, Davar Mavili de Toifa. It's despicable because ultimately when they worship it, it will be a despicable item, but it's not right now despicable. In other words, by the Jew fashioning this, he should be cursed because it will lead to problems later because people will worship it. It'll lead to something despicable. It's not yet despicable, meaning the item isn't yet forbidden. And that's how he'll explain that pasuk. According to his opinion, he doesn't think it's forbidden immediately. Now we get to Rabbi Akiva. What are Rabbi Akiva's sources? So we're going to start with Rabbi Akiva, and the first thing he says about the Gentiles who create the idol worshippers, who make idols. Okay, Avodah Zarah shalovei kochavim. So Rabbi Akiva, Avodah Zarah shalovei kochavim dasura miyad minale. How do we get that when an idol worshiper makes an idol, it's forbidden immediately? Amar ula, amar kra, psilei Elohehen tisrafun be'esh. Now we're going to play with this word psilei. Psilei means idol, right? It's a noun, but they're going to use it as a verb. Misha pislo, when it was fashioned, nase Eloha. It's already considered a god. So when a Gentile fashions an idol, that's a god already. V'idach, okay, what's Rabbi Yishmael going to say to that? That's needed for this braita that Rabbi Yosef brought. The Tani Rabbi Yosef, he brought this braita. Now we're talking about something different. Posel, okay, it's pesel, okay, which is the idol. Lifsol is to sculpt the idol, like a sculpture, and to sculpt, it's the same word. But then there's another word, which is to nullify it. And now he's going to say this actually has to do with laws of nullification. Nothing to do with this, but it's to do with if someone nullifies. This here we're talking about Dafka, specifically creating the prohibition. This is about getting rid of the prohibition, getting rid of the Isur Hana'ah, the prohibition to benefit from it. So we're going to learn from here. We actually learned here the whole law that a Gentile can actually undo the idol and take off the sanctity, right? Not the sanctity, but the prohibition that we can't benefit from. Focus being on the psile. Psile, posle, they can also disqualify it from being an idol, which then makes it permitted for the Jew to benefit. So he learned something completely different from it. V'idach, now the question is, where does Rabbi Kiva learn the laws of bitul? That a Gentile, if you remember, a Jew can't take away the idol of the idol, okay? Once it's an idol, it's forbidden, and a Jew can't get rid of that, but a Gentile can. So v'idach, where's Rabbi Kiva going to learn it from? If he needs psilei Elohim specifically to talk about when it was fashioned, it's forbidden. Well, midrash Shmuel Ramik. Okay, Shmuel brought up the contradiction between psukim. K'tiv lo tachmo kesef zahav alehem. Okay, this is the pasuk we saw. Psulei Elohim tisrafum be'esh. Okay, lo tachmo kesef zahav alehem. So first you should burn them, and you shouldn't desire the gold and the silver that's on them. Okay, that's adorning them. And then it says v'lakachta lecha, which sounds like it's saying don't desire the kesef and zahav v'lakachta lecha. Don't desire it and take it. Because it's going to make you stumble, and it's disgusting, it's despicable to worship idols. So now they say, but if you really pay close attention to the words, it says, Lo tachmo kesef zahav alehem, don't desire the kesef and gold, the silver and gold that's on them. Uktiv v'lakachta lecha, and then it says, and take it. Now, the way we read it was, and don't desire them and take them, okay, meaning don't do all that. But they say it also seems to read as, and take it. How could you take it if you can't desire it? It means don't take it. Haketzad, how does this work? Pislo le'eloha lo tachmod. Psalo me'eloha v'lakachta lecha. So here he plays on the words. If you fashioned it for a god, then lo tachmod. Because remember, it's in the pasuk, psilei Elohim. If you fashioned it if it was fashioned for the gods, then for idols, then lo tachmod, don't desire all the stuff that has to do with it, the gold and silver. But psalome Eloha v'lakachta lecha. But if, now reading again, psile as paslo, if they disqualified it, then you can take it for yourself. Okay, and that's how he'll deal with the way Rabbi Yishmael understood how he's going to learn what Rabbi Yishmael learned from the pasuk he learned his halacha from. So that was a back and forth. Now we get to the final part of this section, which is Rabbi Kiva eshkachat avodah zarah shel avei kochavim dasuam yad. So we prove from psilei Elohim, psalo, it's already forbidden. But that's going to be forbidden immediately. To Yisrael, but where does he get that a Jew is only going to be forbidden when he fashions an idol, she fashions one, when they start worshiping it? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Kras. So Rav Yehuda says there's a pasuk, V'sam b'seiter. This goes back to the pasuk about the. Okay, it's interesting because in the previous one, Rabbi Kiva used this as his proof. Arura ish, right? Cursed is the person who makes an idol. And then it says, V'sam b'seiter. Now, it's funny because Rabbi Yishmael, sorry, I didn't say that right. Rabbi Yishmael is the one who used that pasuk to prove his point about the Jew, because Arura ish, that makes the pesel. But now this says, right, Arura ish, cursed is the person who makes a pesel. It's toivat Hashem, it's despicable. Maseh yedei charash. V'sam b'seiter. No. The Sam B'Seiter we're going to understand here. We're going to understand in two different ways. Right now we're going to understand Sam B'Seiter means, and the person put it in a secret place. Now, what do you think the person did with it in the secret place? Obviously, the Jews worshiping the idol in secret. So until it's actually used, which is usually done in secret, it's not actually forbidden. So the same pasuk that Rabbi Yishmael proved that it's immediately, Rabbi Akiva proves that it's only later. Now, idach, what's Rabbi Yishmael going to do with those words, sam besetel? This is going to come teach us halach we mentioned before. How seen it for Rabbi Yitzchak says, how do you know that the idols of a Jew need to be buried? Shenemar, v'sam beseter, because it says, cursed is the person who fashions an idol, and then it says it's despicable, and then it says it has to be put in secret, not if it was put in secret, which is right, and worshipped, but it has to be put beseter, it has to be buried. V'idach. Now, where does Rabbi Akiva get this halacha from of Geniza if he can't learn it from Sam Beseter because he learns the other halacha from there? Nafkalemi de Rav Chisda Amarav. He learns it from Rav Chisda, said the name of Rav Chisda Amarav. Minayin lavadas Zarah Yisrael shetuna Geniza. How do we know this? That it needs to be buried. Shenemo. Different pasuk entirely. In Sefer Dvarim, lo titalecha asherah kol etz mizbeach. Don't plant an asherah next any asherah tree next to an altar. What do we learn from this? What does an asherah have to do with an altar? Just like a mizbeach that gets ruined, broken, has to be buried. Also, the asherah has to be buried for a completely different reason, right? One is sanctified to God. One was, so to speak, designated for idols. Both in their own way, they both need the same thing to happen to it. Okay, if a Jew, and that then obviously it's only referring if a Jew does it, it needs burial. Because remember, if it's Gentiles, you have to completely destroy it. The idach, right? You have to understand there's a bit of a difference in the idols of the Gentiles. It's all part of this agenda that we have to come into the land and completely wipe out all the idols that are there. Idols the Jews create are a different being, it's something else. It's like from inside we have some problem and we have to get rid of it. So again, it doesn't explain everything here, but it explains what's going on here, why there's differences. The idach, now, if Rabbi Akiva is going to learn Geniza from here. Where is right? What's Rabbi Yishmael going to do with this pasuk about the Asherah? Because he doesn't need it. He has V'sam B'Seitel. She's going to learn it for what Rish Lakish says. Amar Rish Lakish, Kalamami Dayan She'ena Wagun. He's going to learn something completely different. Somebody brings a judge who's not an appropriate judge to be a judge. Okay, they appoint judges that are not appropriate. It's like they're planting Avodah Zarah in the Jewish people. Okay, we know that appointing judges is a very complicated issue, especially political and certain, especially if you're talking about the Supreme Court in different countries, and there's always big issues. Anyway, this is an interesting halacha. If somebody appoints a judge who's not an appropriate judge, okay, what that means exactly is a good question. I think what they really mean here is bribes and things like that. It's like you're planting Avodah Zarah in Israel. It's basically ruining, right? Even they use the image of planting, not just putting up idols, but planting, right? It plants bad seeds that could, we all know how far they could go and the dangers that it could lead to. How do we know this? What does that have to do with the Asherah tree? Well, and as the Asherah, we understand. Where do we get to the judges? Because where's the Asherah tree? 3 psukim after the beginning of Sefer Parshat Shoftim. Set up judges in all your gates. 3 psukim later is this pasuk. And right next to it is lo titalecha asherah kol eitz. Amar Rav Ashi, he just adds something to this. And by the way, they don't ask where Rabbi Akiva gets it from. He just doesn't have that drasha. Obviously, he doesn't think you should do it, but he doesn't necessarily think it's like, he doesn't compare it to Avodah Zarah. With that, we end the ping pong. Amar Rav Ashi, he even darshans even more. It says next to the altar. What he says is, if you have something that's similar to being next to an altar, you have really good Talmidei Chachamim in your town, and instead you put this not good judge, then it's like putting an Asherah tree right in front of the altar, okay, which is a really terrible place to put it. So that ends our sugya of Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva, the 4, each proving, right? We had to prove 4 things, the 2 different halachot of Rabbi Yishmael and the 2 different halachot of Rabbi Akiva, which each were completely flipped from the other and what the other did with each other's proofs. Now we move on to the section of questions. We're going to have a slew of questions. Some of them are going to end with a teku. Some will have an answer, or one will have an answer. By Rav Hamnuna. You have a broken vessel and you weld it back together for the purposes of worshiping idols, which we assume means you're going to serve the idol something with using that vessel. It's a serving implement. Mahu, what's the situation? So now they want to know what's the question. Avodah Zarah diman. Well, the first thing we have to figure out is who fashioned this and for what purpose. So if it's a Gentile fashioned it, Bain the Rabbi Yishmael, Bain the Rabbi Akiva, Misham She'avodah Zarah. Okay, well, they each are going to view this as Misham She'avodah Zarah, right? Something that's serving the idol of the Gentile. And Misham She'avodah Zarah, Asurin Ad She'avdu. Actually, nobody disagrees about things that serve the idols. Remember, we talked about that. The kalim for sure are only prohibited after you worship. That was the whole thing about the mekomot or the kalim, and the kalim are asher avdu aknanim, right? That they worshipped it. The only machloket was, do we extend that also to the gods, to the idols? So that for sure, the obvious answer would be they're not forbidden until you worship. Just fashioning the vessel, this broken vessel, putting it back together for the purposes of using it for idol worship, not that it was used before for idol worship, but just now it's used for idol worship. Well, that's not, no one's going to think that's forbidden immediately. Okay, option 2, El Avodah Zarah Yisrael. Well, if it's a Jew did this, Aliba Deman, according to Elam Aliba de Rabbi Akiva, Hashi Gufalo Mitasra Ajteave Mishamshem Mibaya. Now, if you hold according to Rabbi Akiva that the Jew who does fashions an idol, it's not forbidden until he worships it, well, then of course the vessel that's going to serve the idol, of course, wouldn't even be a question. Obviously, only once it's worshipped. Ella aliba de Rabbi Yishmael de Amar Surah miyad mai. The question must be according to Rabbi Yishmael, who thinks it's forbidden immediately. Here's the question: Mishamshim mishamshim kamrinan. Are we going to learn things that serve the idol from things that serve the idol of the Gentile, which is those everyone agrees are permitted? So maybe we'll learn also if the Jews permitted until it's actually worshipped. Or, right, mahatamachi abdu apachachi abdu, since there it's until you worship it. Also here, odilma minagamar, or maybe we're going to learn Jew from Jew, right? Is it mishamshim from mishamshim, right? Things that serve the idol from things that serve the idol, Jew to from Gentile, or are we going to learn it because we don't have a rule about serving things that serve the idol of the Jew? Maybe we should learn it from the idol of the Jew itself. And since that's forbidden immediately, then maybe this would be, right? So maybe it would be forbidden immediately. But before we get to even trying to give an answer, the Gemara is going to reject the question entirely based on the wording of the question or the content of the question. My area to come to asa. If the whole question is mishamshim of a Jew, right? A mishamshim of Avodah Zarah of a Jew, is it like mishamshim of Gentiles, ad she'avod, or is it like a Jew like the idol of a Jew immediately? That would be a question not for ritech, where you welded it back together. It would be a question for you fashioned a vessel to serve the idol. So it doesn't make sense that he would ask his question in this way. From the wording of his question, you can understand that wasn't his question. We obviously got it wrong. It would have to be something where welding it back together would be relevant. So let's move on and see the second interpretation of the question. Rav Hamnuna mishum tuma yashana kamebayle. They now say Rav Hamnuna must have been asking a question about previous impurity. Okay, what are we talking about? Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, klei matachot pshutehem u'mekablehen tmeim. Okay, there's different substances that we make vessels, so we fashion vessels out of. If it's metals, there are different rules for different things. So if it's wood, there's certain rules. If it's metal, even flat ones, pshutehem, are forbidden. Usually you need it to have like a receptacle. Flat ones don't have a receptacle, but if it's klei matachot pshutehem u'mekablehem tmeim. Okay, both flat ones and ones that have a receptacle in them are forbidden. Become impure. Nishtabru taru, if they break, they become immediately pure because they're no longer, it's like the tumah leaves them. However, it doesn't leave completely because chazar v'asum kelim, now here comes our ritech. If you put it back to be a vessel again, yaftaru l'tumatan l'tumah yishana, they go back to their original tumah. Okay, that's a Mishnah. Now, here comes Rav Hamnuna's question. If you remember, we learned that Avodah Zarah, the rabbis decreed that it's going to have impurity. Anything we're used for worshiping Avodah Zarah is considered tamei. It's to get people to stay away from it, really. Now, it's a tumah d'Rabbanan. So hachi kamabayli. Here's the question: Ki hadra tumah hanimili l'tumah d'oraita, tumah d'Rabbanan lo. When we say the tumah goes back, when we put the kli back together, is that only for d'oraita tumah, but not here where it's only d'Rabbanan? It's just gzera d'Rabbanan the tumah. Oh, dimaloshna, or maybe it doesn't make a difference. We just learn tumah from there. Okay, once it's tamei, it has all the rules of tumah, and the tumah will go back to being, the kli will be tamei again. So now the Gemara says, wait, why don't you ask then about any tumah d'Rabbanan? Why specifically Avodah Zarah? To which they say, well, it's like a question within a question, meaning tumah d'Rabbanan mihadro lo hadro. The first question really Rav Hamnuna asked was, Is Tumah D'Rabbanan like Tumah D'Oraita for this issue? Will the Tumah go back when you refashion the Kli, or is it gone? Okay, and it doesn't come back because it's weaker Tumah. Now, if you want to say the Tumah doesn't go back, Tumah D'Avodah Zarah, Mishum Chumer D'Avodah Zarah, but Tumah D'Avodah Zarah maybe would be different because we would say, Mishum Chumer D'Avodah Zarah, Mishavia Rabbanan K'Tumah D'Oraita Ola. Because we've already seen this many times, Avodah Zarah is more severe than anything else. So even though it's only rabbinic, it's somewhere hovering between rabbinic and Torah law. And maybe we're going to treat it like Torah law for this halacha, that the tumah will go back if you refashion the kli. And that's the question. And now the answer is teku. We don't actually have an answer. Okay, moving now to the next question. By Mine, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yana. Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Yana the following question. Tikrovet avodah zarah shel ochalim ma. If you bring, okay, this happens all the time in idol worship houses. I saw this in Vietnam. People bring idols. They bring food to the idols. They bring fresh flowers. They bring fresh fruits and vegetables, and they put it in front of the idol, right? We've seen this many times in Masechet. I just wanted to point out how I've actually seen this. So tikrovet avodah zarah ochalim ma. What if somebody used this food, brought it to their idol, and now I want to benefit from it? Is it forbidden to benefit from? Now, we're actually, sorry, I said it wrong. It's not hana'ah, of course, it's tikrovet avodah zarah. Now, what do we learn? Tikrovet avodah zarah ina b'telah olamit. You can never actually undo that, okay? Once you bring something, food, it can't be undone, and the prohibition of benefiting from it is there forever. However, the question is, if they bring food to the idol, and let's say they decide they don't want to give it to the idol anymore. Now, that doesn't really work, but, okay, it's still forbidden to benefit from. But the tumah, that this rabbinic tumah that we talked about just before, the rabbi said, oh, tikrovet avodah zarah has tumah. Well, does the impurity go away? That's the question. Okay, does the bitul allow it, right? The fact that the Gentile said, I don't want to bring this anymore, the idol worshiper said, I don't want to bring this anymore to my idol, would that mean it's not impure? So now the Gemara says, okay, back to the same thing we said before. Why didn't you just ask about vessels? Why did you specifically ask about food? Kalim lo kabit. They didn't ask about vessels because vessels, it's obvious that what? Kevin de ile tara b'mikvah, you could put in a mikvah and make it pure. Therefore, tumanami batla, we're going to assume the impurity there is lighter and therefore it comes and goes more easily, so we can get rid of it. But you can't put food in a mikvah and say, oh, we're going to take off the impurity. So ki kamabayale ochlin. That's why we asked about ochlin. Now they say, why do you go with the tikrovet though? Tibayale avodah zarah gufa. Why don't you just ask about the idol itself? Does the idol still have impurity once it's nullified? So the Gemara says, avodah zarah gufa lo mebayale. I wouldn't ask the question about the idol itself. Turning out I'm a bet. Why is that? Well, kivandi isur batil. It's actually ironic. The idol itself could be nullified from being an idol completely. We've learned that. The Gentile could say, I don't want to worship this anymore, right? We had the stones that then they used in the ground. And so tumanami batla, but for sure the impurity is gone from there. The real question is kimabayale, and that's what I told you before, specifically tikrovet lavadas shel ochli mai. Kevandi isur lo batil kidurav gidol, tumanami lo batla. The real question is, since the Isur can never be canceled, as Rav Gidol said. Rav Gidol said on Daf Nun Amud Aleph that tikrovet avodah zarah eina b'telah olamit. Once it was given as a gift to an idol, you cannot nullify it. It's always going to be forbidden. So, do we say then that the tumah is also not nullified, or dilma isura deoraita lo batil tuma derabbanan batil? Or maybe we say, look, the fact that this tikrovet, what I brought to use is to serve the idol, is canceled. Okay, this, I brought it as an offering to the idol. It can never be canceled. The prohibition of benefiting is there forever, but that's the prohibition to benefit from it is a Torah law. But this tumah is only rabbinic. So maybe that does go away. Maybe that could be nullified. And the answer again, teku. We don't have an answer. Third question. Ba'amina Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul mi Rebbe. Kelim, so Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul asked Rebbe the following question. Kelim sheshemshu b'hem bebeit chonyo. Okay, what's Beit Chonyo? So Rashi quotes a Gemara Menachot that says Chonyo was the son of Shimon HaTzadik. He ran away to Egypt from his brother, and he built there an altar. He wanted to worship God, so he built an altar, and there's a big machloket there. Was it Avodah Zarah, or was it not Avodah Zarah? Was it really for God? And he fashioned it, it looked like the Beit HaMikdash. So our sugya is going to go, and we're going to say so in a minute, inside. We're going to ask this question according to the one who says it wasn't idol worship. It was just outside the temple, which is prohibited, but it wasn't for idol worship purposes. So now we're going to say the following. His question is, if they used vessels in Beit Chonyo, can we use them in the Beit HaMikdash? And obviously his question is asked according to Man Damar Beit Chonyo La Beit Avodah Zarah. Okay, the one who says it's not idol worship, because if it was idol worship, we're not going to be able to take the vessels and use them in the temple. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. Kohanim sheshimshu bebeit chonyo, and the question is going to be based on this Mishnah. The Mishnah says, it's the Mishnah in Menachot, Kohanim sheshimshu bebeit chonyo lo yishamshu b'mikdash b'Yerushalayim. If you were a Kohen in Chonyo's temple, you cannot go serve in the Beit HaMikdash as a Kohen. Ve'eno tzarich lomar ledavar acher, and all the more so if you were a Kohen for idols. Okay, but here we're saying Beit Chonyo wasn't idols; it was just outside the temple. You're not allowed to do that, and you can't worship in the temple. Now, the question is, are we going to say the same thing for vessels? Now, why would we think to distinguish? And this is Rabbi Yossi ben Shal's question. Well, the Kohanim were penalized by the rabbis because they think and they're human beings and they knew they were doing something wrong and they did it anyway. Aval kelim lo, but maybe vessels not, because vessels have no brains. They didn't do anything wrong, so to speak. So maybe lo shna, maybe it would be different. Well, Rebbe answers, Amar le asurim, they're forbidden. Umikra hayabi, and I had a pasuk to prove it, but I forgot it. So now the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul says, Eitivei, brings a difficulty. He says, wait a minute, you're saying the vessels are forbidden, but I'm going to prove to you that they're okay. Now here we're going to a pasuk in Chronicles where it talks about the vessels when Chizkiyahu did a reformation in the temple, and they took all the vessels that his father Achaz had used to worship idols, and they took them and hechanu v'gidashnu. What does that mean? My love hechanu. So comes Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul and says, Da'at bilinu, they must have toveled them. And Ikdashnu is Akdashninu, and then they sanctified them. These were used for idols, and they could use them. So all the more so, Beit Chonyo should be able to be used. Amarle, Baruch atah l'shamayim. Rebbe is thrilled. He says, so blessed are you. Shechezarta li'avedati, because you returned me my lost item. I couldn't remember what my pasuk I proved that they're forbidden from, and it's actually the pasuk you used to prove they're permitted. That's the one that says they're forbidden. Why? Because you misunderstood the pasuk. Hechanu shegnazum. What does it mean they prepared them? They prepared them to be buried, and they buried them. Hikdashnu shikdashnu achirim tachtehem. They sanctified others in their place. They needed new vessels. Now we're going to go through a whole long thing to try to prove Rebbe. In the end, we're not going to be able to prove Rebbe, but at least Rebbe has his pasuk, and even though he disagrees with the Rebbe, Yossi ben Shaul interprets the pasuk, he has his proof. But we're going to try to prove Rebbe that you can't use these vessels from Beit Chonyo from the following source, but in the end, we're not going to be able to. Lema Maseh, and here we have a Mishnah in Mido, Masechet Mido, which is all about the different things in the temple. It's a lishka, it's one of these chambers, Mizrachit Tzfonit, on the northeast side. Ba ganzu beit Chashmonai et avnei mizbeach sheshiketzu anshe Yavan. So the Chashmonaim, when they came in, when they went back to the temple, they took the stones of the altar that the Greeks had defiled. What does it mean they defiled them? They used them for idol worship. And they took them and they buried them. So now, Amar of Papa, so basically, what does that prove? Now, they actually weren't forbidden because of idol worship, because by Torah law, they weren't like asurim b'hana'ah, because they came and defiled things that weren't theirs. They came into the Jews temple and they used for their idols, but you can't forbid something that's not your own. So it actually didn't become theirs. And because it didn't become theirs, it's not actually forbidden b'hana'ah, and therefore it's kind of like chonyo. And yet they had to bury them. So what you see, you can't use them in the temple. But Rav Papa says, no. That's not why. And therefore, this doesn't prove your point, even though maybe you're right, but this doesn't prove it. Because they found the pasuk and they darshaned it. They came in and they chililuha. Now, what is chililuha? Milashon, they made it chulin. They made it not sanctified anymore. And with that, they were mafkir. Like everything became ownerless. They actually took ownership of it, and the stuff was no longer sanctified. They used it to worship their idols, and therefore it was actually forbidden by Hana'ah, by Torah law. Amre, and then when they came back, they said, Hey, Chinavi, what are we going to do with these? Nitbarinu, let's say we break them. Because if you break them, remember, well, not if a Jew breaks them, but if you get a Gentile to break them, then it's actually nullified, right? You find the idol worshiper says, these are not ours, right? We're not using them for worship anymore. And then the Jews theoretically could use it, but what's the problem? Well, they were originally the stones from their altar, so they want to use it to build a new altar, but they can't do that because of Avadim Shleimot Amar Rachmani. You have to build the altar with whole stones. These are now broken because idol worshiper just broke them to nullify them. Ninatzrinu, well, let's say we take the broken pieces and we make them smooth. We smooth them out. Well, lo tani falehem Brazil. You're not allowed to make an altar with stones that you used iron implements with. How else would they smooth them out with not with an iron implement? Amar Rahman, right? The Torah says can't use Brazil on the stones for the altar. So basically, there's nothing to do with them, and that's why they buried them. Okay, and that's because they were forbidden to benefit from, and they couldn't be nullified. To which, or if they could be nullified, you wouldn't be able to use them on the altar. To which the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Amai, litabarinu v'lishgalinu l'nafshe. You could actually have the Gentile nullify them. They don't need to bury them. Anyone on the street could use them because once they nullify them, there's no prohibition to benefit from. So maybe you can't use them on the altar because of the two problems of the not being whole, using iron implements, but anyone could use them. Mi lo amar, and didn't they say? Rav Oshaya said, "Bikshu lignos kol kesef v'zahav shebaolam mishum kaspa v'dava shel Yerushalayim." Rav Oshaya said they wanted to forbid all the gold and silver in the world because of the gold and silver when the Romans took over, destroyed the temple. They took all this money, and now it's all around the world because the Romans were everywhere, and any money could be sanctified money that people had in Jerusalem that they were planning to use in the temple. The Havina, well, before we even get to the issue here, Havina, they asked, wait a minute, Yerushalayim, have you Ruba Alma? Wait, Jerusalem is like the majority of the money in the world, right? I mean, even though there are people who say the Jews ruled the world, financially, still, the majority of the money in the world was not from Jerusalem. Ela Amar Abaye Bikshu, so Abaye fixes this. Bikshu lignos dinara, hadriana, turiana, shiafa. They wanted to do this particular coins that were with Hadrian and Turiana. I forgot exactly who that is, but these were Roman emperors that were shiafa. They were nice coins that were, smooth coins. These were the rulers that were in Jerusalem at the time. So the money that was minted with their picture on it were most likely from Jerusalem. That's what they wanted lignos. But then they found a pasuk from the Torah that said they were permitted. They came in and they disgraced it, which really means though they turned it into chulin and they took away the sanctity of it. So once they take away the sanctity of it, it's no longer forbidden. So now they explain. Anyway, the whole point is there's a way to remove the sanctity. So why didn't they just let everybody use this? And why wasn't it treated like the money that everyone now can use money around the world? There's a difference between the stones taken from the altar and used for idol worship and the money that was taken from Jerusalem that maybe was sanctified money. There, it was sanctified by people, but it wasn't ever used for high purposes, right? Because they brought it to Jerusalem, they hadn't yet spent the money. But this was actually used as an altar. People worshipped on it, sacrifices on it. It's not appropriate to have regular people using it. And that's why they didn't, right? So now they theoretically could have, but they didn't, and that's why they buried it. And likewise, right, this just doesn't prove anything about Chanyo because this was a unique case where it was actually the sanctity was the Avodah Zarah was actually removed from it, or could have been removed from it. Okay, but that's because it says Chilaluha. But without that pasuk, we're going to assume Beit Chanyo could still be perhaps the vessels are forbidden. Actually, one second. Right, Rav Sheshet said, sorry, we tried to prove from the Anshe Yavan that they were forbidden, but Rav Papa said no. With the Yavan, that was unique why it was forbidden. And that's because that's because they had nothing to do with it. That's why they had to bury it. Because even though you could have removed the sanctity, they couldn't because they couldn't use it on the altar anymore. But it doesn't prove anything about Beit Chanyo, and therefore your proof isn't good. Okay, from here we're going to go to the next Mishnah. Ovei kochavim mevatel ovei kochavim shelo v'shel chavero. Idol worshiper can do this. We've seen many times already, but here we see it in the Mishnah. Can nullify his own idol and one of his friends. The Israel ein mevatel avodah zarah shel ovei kochavim, but a Jew can't nullify the idols of a Gentile. Hamevatel avodah zarah mevatel mishamsheha. If a Gentile nullifies Avodah Zarah, so all the implements that serve that idol are nullified as well. But if you nullify just the things that serve the idol, then the idol itself does not make sense. Right? The person didn't nullify the idol, so the idol is still forbidden. Now we're going to start with the Gemara. Manela Rebbe la Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. He taught the Mishnah like this, exactly how we have it. Cancel it. We can nullify his own idol. We can even nullify someone else's idol. However, Amarle Rebbe. So Amarle, his son Rabbi Shimon said to him, Rebbe, Shanita lanu b'yaldutcha, but you taught this in a different way when we were younger. A Gentile can nullify his own idol and a Jew's. Now, they say, Yisrael, mikam evatla, how can, so first of all, they stop and they say, what do you mean? How could he nullify a Jew's? We already learned that Jews can never be nullified, has to be buried. So, Amar Rabbi Hillel, Berei Rav Alus, Lo nitzracha ela sheyesh bo shutafut. What it means, this line is, if a Jew and a Gentile together were partners, and they had an idol, and the Gentile nullifies it, it's nullified for the Jew as well. Okay, that's what he means. Now, according to version 1, but according to version 2, no. Gentile can only do it if it's a Gentiles as well, and not a Jews. So, B'yaldu Toma Kasavra, B'zignu Toma Kasavra. What did he think originally, and what did he think eventually? Why did Rebbe change his mind? B'yaldu Tosavar, Yisrael Adatza Dovei Kochavim Palach. If the two are partners, they assume that the Jew is only worshiping it because the Gentiles worshiping it. Once the Gentile nullifies his portion of it, Yisrael Nami Vata. Well, the Jew was only following the Gentile anyway, so it's really the Gentile's nullification, and that should work. But then he realized when he was older, maybe he was a little bit more optimistic when he was younger, and then he realized what the reality is. Yisrael Adata Dinafshe Palach. The Jews, together with the Gentiles, actually worshiping it because the Jew wants to worship an idol. And if it's jointly owned and the Gentile nullifies the Gentile's portion, it doesn't mean, the idol worshiper, doesn't mean that the Jew is going to nullify their portion. And therefore, that's how he understood eventually, and that's why he changed his mind. That's the first version of Rav Uvalis. Some people say that it's talking about the other line, and his statement was made on that, which we're going to explain in the next class. So stop here. What we did here, very simply, we'll summarize the opinions of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. We went through each of the proofs of their two totally, completely opposite opinions of the four options of Jew, Gentile, and is it forbidden immediately from the time it was fashioned or only from the time it was worshipped? We proved all their opinions and showed what each one does with the other verses. We had 3 questions. 2 had to do with impurity of the Avodah Zarah that the rabbis instituted. And one was about when you refashion the kli, does the tumah come back? And the other was about the tikrovet of food. Does the tumah go off if you nullify it, even though the prohibition of benefiting it is still there? Both those were left with the teku. And the third and last question was, in Beit Chonyo, can you use it in the Beit HaMikdash? And Rebbe said, no, vessels that we use there can't be used, just like the Kohanim, also the vessels. And we don't make that distinction that they had suggested. Then we tried to prove Rebbe's opinion from this other source, but that was not successful. And then we had the Mishnah, which talked about nullifying Avodah Zarah, and from there we got into this switch that Rebbe made about jointly owned Avodah Zarah between a Jew and Gentile, and it was nullified by the Gentile. Is it nullified for the Jew, or is it not nullified because the Jew still has part ownership? That was, what he changed his mind about. But we're going to see a possibly different explanation in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.